June 25th, 2009. The date burns in the memory of every music lover who lived through that dark Thursday afternoon. Los Angeles seemed to hold its breath as news helicopters circled above the UCLA Medical Center, their blades cutting through the thick summer air. Inside those sterile hospital walls, the impossible had become reality. Michael Joseph Jackson, the king of pop, the moonwalking maestro who had soundtracked 3 generations of lives, was gone. At 50 years old, the man who seemed immortal on stage had fallen silent forever. The world didn't just mourn. It convulsed. From Tokyo to Toronto, from London to Lagos, people poured into the streets holding candles, playing his music, weeping openly for a stranger who felt like family. His songs had been the backdrop to first kisses, wedding dances, championship victories, and quiet moments of personal triumph. Now those same songs became funeral hymns for collective grief. Television networks abandoned regular programming. Radio stations played nothing but Michael's catalog. Social media platforms, still relatively young, crashed under the weight of millions simultaneously expressing their disbelief and sorrow. But while the public grieved openly, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something strange. Something that would later fuel 1,000 conspiracy theories and sleepless nights for those closest to the Jackson family. Within hours of Michael's death being announced, an unusual level of security descended upon Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Black SUVs with tinted windows arrived in convoys. Men in dark suits with A-pieces took positions around the property. Phone lines to the cemetery were suddenly disconnected from public access. Even staff members who had worked there for decades found themselves escorted off certain grounds, told in firm voices that their services wouldn't be needed for the foreseeable future. The Jackson family released carefully worded statements expressing their devastation, but they said nothing about funeral arrangements. Days passed, then weeks. The media, hungry for any detail, began pressing for information about when and where Michael would be laid to rest. The family remained silent. This wasn't normal. High-profile figures typically received burial within days of passing, with elaborate public ceremonies allowing fans to say goodbye. But Michael's family seemed to be stalling, and nobody could understand why. Rumors started circulating among cemetery workers and security personnel. Whispered conversations in parking lots. Coded text messages between friends. Something was being prepared at Forest Lawn, something that required absolute secrecy. Construction crews arrived at odd hours, working through the night under powerful floodlights. The sounds of drilling and hammering echoed across the memorial park's normally peaceful grounds. Whatever they were building, it was substantial, and it was being done with a level of urgency that suggested something far more complex than a simple burial plot. Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, looked increasingly frail in the rare photographs that emerged during this period. She wore dark sunglasses that couldn't hide the puffiness around her eyes, the weight of sleepless nights evident in every line of her face. She had lost her son, yes, but those close to the family whispered that something else was troubling her, something beyond the normal scope of maternal grief. When asked directly about the burial plans, she would simply shake her head and walk away, unable or unwilling to discuss what was really happening. The coroner's office held Michael's body for weeks, conducting an autopsy that seemed to take an unusually long time. Official explanations cited the need for thorough toxicology reports, but insiders suggested something different. They hinted that the delay wasn't entirely medical. Someone was buying time. Someone needed that time to prepare something that had never been done before. The question that haunted everyone who knew the truth was simple and terrible. What were they hiding? And more importantly, why did Michael Jackson's burial require such extraordinary secrecy? September 3rd, 2009, just after midnight. Most of Los Angeles slept, unaware that history was unfolding in the darkness. Inside Forest Lawn Memorial Park, a scene played out that resembled something from a Hollywood thriller, except this was devastatingly real. The cemetery had been completely locked down for hours. Every entrance blocked. Every road leading to the property monitored by private security firms whose employees had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Even the airspace above had been restricted, with the FAA issuing a temporary flight ban that prohibited news helicopters or curious pilots from observing what was happening below. The family arrived in separate vehicles, their headlights cutting through the night like searchlights seeking answers in the void. Katherine Jackson emerged from a car moving slowly, supported by two of her sons. She wore black from head to toe, a veil covering her face, her body language speaking of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. This was a weariness of a soul that had been asked to bear too much. Behind her came Michael's children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, their young faces struggling to comprehend why their father's final goodbye had to happen in secret, under cover of darkness, away from the millions who loved him. The casket was already in place, but not in any ordinary location. Forest Lawn staff, sworn to secrecy, had worked for over 2 months preparing what could only be described as a fortress. The final resting place wasn't a simple plot in the ground or even a standard mausoleum niche. It was something far more elaborate, far more secure, and far more troubling in its implications. The casket would be placed inside the Great Mausoleum, in the Holy Terror section, an area typically reserved for Hollywood royalty. But Michael's spot had been specially modified with features that went far beyond preserving dignity or ensuring privacy. The security measures were extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The casket itself was crafted from bronze and lined with materials designed to withstand not just time but potential interference. Multiple layers of protection surrounded the burial chamber. Reinforced concrete walls, steel barriers, and sophisticated alarm systems that would make a bank vault jealous. Video surveillance covered every angle, recording continuously and feeding to a monitoring station that would be staffed around the clock. Motion sensors, pressure plates, biometric locks that required family authorization to approach the burial site. This wasn't just a resting place. It was a bunker. Why such extreme measures? The official explanation given to the small gathering of family members was protection from obsessed fans and grave robbers. Michael's fame made him a target even in death, they were told. The family needed assurance that his body would remain undisturbed, that his final peace wouldn't be violated by those seeking macabre souvenirs or media attention. It was a reasonable explanation on the surface, one that made sense given the bizarre behavior of some fans who had already begun treating the cemetery like a pilgrimage site during the weeks before the burial. But several family members weren't buying it. They exchanged glances during the ceremony, silent conversations happening through worried eyes. They had questions that weren't being answered, questions about why the burial had been delayed so long, questions about who exactly was making these security decisions and paying for these elaborate precautions, questions about why they felt more like they were watching their loved one being locked away than laid to rest. The ceremony itself was brief, almost rushed. A few prayers, some tears. Then cemetery staff, moving with practiced efficiency, began the process of sealing Michael away behind layer after layer of protection. As the family filed out into the cool September night, Paris Jackson, then just 11 years old, turned back for one last look, her small hand pressed against the mausoleum's marble wall, as if trying to reach through stone and steel to touch her father one more time. A security guard gently guided her away, his voice kind but firm. The area was now restricted, he explained. Even family would need special permission and advance notice to visit. The girl's tears reflected the floodlights as she was led back to the waiting cars. Above them, the Los Angeles sky glittered with indifferent stars, keeping whatever secrets the universe holds about why the world's most celebrated entertainer was being treated like a government asset requiring maximum security rather than beloved father finally coming home. The secret couldn't hold. Secrets of this magnitude never do, especially in the age of smartphones and social media. Within 48 hours of Michael's midnight burial, photographs began circulating online. Blurry images captured by cemetery workers, security personnel, or perhaps curious neighbors with telephoto lenses. The pictures showed the massive security operation, the reinforced structures, the level of protection that seemed wildly disproportionate to simply deterring grave robbers. Internet forums exploded with speculation. What was the Jackson family hiding? What were they protecting? Or more disturbingly, what were they protecting Michael from? The theories came fast and furious, each more elaborate than the last. Some claimed Michael wasn't actually dead, that the elaborate security was designed to hide the fact that his casket was empty or contained someone else entirely. They pointed to inconsistencies in the death reports, unusual behavior by family members, and the convenient timing of the burial happening under darkness. Videos appeared on YouTube with ominous music and dramatic narration, connecting dots that may or may not have existed, building cases for Michael's survival that convinced millions of desperate fans who simply couldn't accept that their idol was gone. Others suggested something darker. They whispered about the entertainment industry's secrets, about powerful people who might have reason to ensure that Michael's body was never examined too closely, never subjected to independent verification. These theorists pointed to Michael's increasingly erratic public statements in the years before his death, his claims of being manipulated and controlled, his fears about certain people in the music business. Had he been silenced? Was the fortress-like burial designed to prevent any future investigation into the true circumstances of his death? The theories grew teeth, spreading through online communities like viruses, infecting the minds of those already predisposed to distrust official narratives. Then came the lawsuit that changed everything. In late 2009, a journalist from a respected publication filed a Freedom of Information request seeking details about the security arrangements at Forest Lawn. The request was denied on privacy grounds, which only fueled more suspicion. The journalist persisted, eventually finding a former Forest Lawn employee willing to talk anonymously. What this employee revealed sent shockwaves through both the fan community and mainstream media outlets finally paying serious attention to the story. The anonymous source, speaking through voice distortion on a radio interview, claimed that the security measures at Michael's burial site weren't primarily about keeping people out. They were about monitoring what was happening inside. The surveillance system, the motion sensors, the continuous recording, all of it was focused on the casket itself. The source suggested that questions existed about what was actually in that sealed bronze container, that certain parties needed ongoing verification of its contents. The implications were staggering. If the source was telling the truth, someone was watching Michael's body around the clock, as if expecting something to change or waiting for something to happen. Forest Lawn immediately issued denials, calling the allegations outlandish and disrespectful to the Jackson family. They threatened legal action against anyone spreading false information about their facility or their clients. The Jackson family attorney released a toast statement saying the family was disgusted by the conspiracy theories and asking for privacy during their continued grief. But the denials felt hollow, too aggressive, too defensive. They did little to quiet the growing chorus of people demanding answers about what was really happening behind the marble walls of the great mausoleum. Media outlets that had previously dismissed the conspiracy theories as fringe nonsense began investigating more seriously. Reporters staked out Forest Lawn, documenting the unusual security presence that persisted months after the burial. They interviewed cemetery workers, security contractors, and construction personnel who had worked on the site. Most refused to comment, citing their non-disclosure agreements. But a pattern emerged from those willing to speak off the record. Everyone agreed on one thing: whatever had been built for Michael Jackson's burial was unprecedented. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the cemetery. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the country. The question that haunted every investigation, every late-night radio show discussion, every online forum debate was becoming impossible to ignore. What secret was so important that it required treating the King of Pop's final resting place like a military installation? By early 2010, the pressure had become unbearable. The Jackson family, already strained by decades of complicated dynamics, fame, and financial pressures, began showing cracks that would eventually become chasms. At the center of the conflict was a fundamental disagreement about Michael's burial and the extraordinary measures surrounding it. Not everyone in the family had been told the complete truth about what was happening at Forest Lawn. Some had been kept deliberately in the dark, given partial explanations, and asked to trust that everything was being handled appropriately. Now those family members wanted answers, and they wanted them immediately. Joe Jackson, Michael's father, became increasingly vocal about his concerns. Despite his complicated relationship with Michael during life, marked by allegations of abuse and control, Joe now positioned himself as a protector of his son's legacy. In a series of interviews that made headlines worldwide, he suggested that something wasn't right about the burial. He claimed that family members were being kept away from Michael's gravesite, that visits required advanced scheduling and supervision, that a level of control being exerted over access to his dead son felt wrong. His voice carried the frustration of a man accustomed to being in charge who suddenly found himself on the outside looking in. LaToya Jackson, Michael's sister, went even further. In a book published in 2011, she made explosive allegations about her brother's death and its aftermath. She suggested that Michael had been murdered, that powerful forces in the entertainment industry had wanted him silenced, and that the elaborate security surrounding his burial was designed to prevent any independent verification of what had really happened to him. She claimed family members who asked too many questions were threatened or intimidated into silence. Her allegations were met with fierce pushback from other family members, particularly those who had been more involved in the burial arrangements and who insisted everything had been done properly and with Michael's wishes in mind. Katherine Jackson found herself caught in the middle, torn between her children's conflicting versions of truth. She had been the one to make the final decisions about Michael's burial, guided by advisors, attorneys, and estate executors who assured her they were protecting her son's legacy. But now, facing accusations from her own family that she had been manipulated or misled, she began having her own doubts. Close friends reported that Katherine was sleeping poorly, that she would wake in the middle of the night troubled by questions she couldn't answer. Had she done right by her son? Had she allowed him to be locked away behind barriers that served someone else's interests rather than Michael's peace? The situation reached a breaking point in March 2010 when several Jackson family members, led by Joe, attempted to visit Michael's grave without the advance notice typically required. They arrived at Forest Lawn with a small media presence in tow, demanding immediate access to their family member's resting place. Security personnel stopped them at the gate, explaining that the Holly Terrace section required scheduled visits with proper authorization. Joe Jackson, his face flushed with anger and frustration, shouted that he was a father, that he had every right to visit his son whenever he chose. The confrontation was captured on camera, broadcast worldwide, and became a defining image of just how abnormal the situation had become. Behind closed doors, emergency family meetings were called. Arguments erupted about who had authorized what, who was receiving money from Michael's estate, and whether that influenced their positions, who could be trusted and who might be compromised by outside interests. The family that had once functioned as a unified, if troubled, entertainment dynasty was fracturing along fault lines that might never be repaired. Some members hired their own attorneys, seeking independent information about the burial arrangements and the legal documents that governed access to Michael's remains. Private investigators were brought in by concerned family members, tasked with uncovering the truth about what was really happening at Forest Lawn. These investigators discovered troubling details. The security contract for Michael's burial site was being paid for not by the family directly, but by the estate's executors, who controlled Michael's assets and intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The same people managing Michael's business interests were making decisions about his physical remains. The investigators also discovered that the security company had previous contracts with government agencies and high-level corporate clients, specializing in situations requiring absolute discretion and ironclad protection. Why would such a company be necessary for celebrity burial? As 2010 progressed, the family's public image deteriorated. Every interview seemed to contradict the previous one. Every statement released by one family member was disputed by another. The media, sensing blood in the water, intensified their coverage, turning the Jackson family drama into daily entertainment for millions. But beneath the tabloid headlines and the reality show spectacle, a genuine tragedy was unfolding. A family was tearing itself apart because no one would tell them the complete truth about why Michael Jackson's burial had required such extreme, such unprecedented, such deeply suspicious measures. And the people who did know the truth, whoever they were, had apparently decided that some secrets were worth destroying a family to protect. 15 years would pass before the real story emerged, and when it finally did, it came from an unexpected source. In 2024, a deathbed confession from a former estate attorney named Gerald Simmons provided the missing pieces of a puzzle that had haunted millions. Simmons, dying from cancer and wanting to clear his conscience, arranged an interview with a documentary filmmaker. What he revealed was simultaneously more mundane and more disturbing than any conspiracy theory had imagined. The truth, as is often the case, was about money, control, and the desperate lengths people will go to protect both. Michael Jackson's estate, Simmons explained, was worth far more than anyone publicly acknowledged. Beyond the obvious assets like music catalogs and property, there were complicated financial instruments, overseas holdings, and intellectual property rights that generated hundreds of millions annually. But there was a problem. Several entities, including insurance companies, creditors, and business partners, had claims against the estate that could only be settled with absolute proof of Michael's death. Not just a death certificate, which could theoretically be faked or disputed, but ongoing, verifiable proof that Michael Jackson was indeed deceased and his body was where it was supposed to be. The elaborate security at Forest Lawn wasn't about protecting Michael from fans or grave robbers. It was about protecting the estate's financial interests from legal challenges. The continuous surveillance, the multiple layers of security, the restricted access, all of it existed to create an undeniable chain of custody and verification. If anyone ever challenged a death in court, if any insurance company tried to deny a payout, if any business partner claimed fraud, the estate could provide definitive, monitored, continuously documented proof that Michael Jackson's body was exactly where it was supposed to be, unchanged and undisturbed. The estate executors had made a calculated decision in those frantic days after Michael's death. They understood that his fame and the circumstances surrounding his passing would generate conspiracy theories. They knew that for years, possibly decades, people would question whether he was really dead. These questions could tie up the estate in litigation that might last for generations, preventing the full monetization of Michael's legacy and the distribution of assets to his heirs. The fortress burial was designed to make such litigation impossible by providing incontrovertible proof that would satisfy any court in the world. But why hadn't they just explained this to the family? Simmons's answer was chilling in its cold pragmatism. The executors had been advised by their legal team that informing the family of the true purpose behind the security measures could create liability. If family members knew the burial site was essentially a financial asset being monitored for business purposes rather than a sacred resting place being protected out of respect, they might object. They might file their own lawsuits claiming the estate was treating Michael's remains as property rather than honoring his memory. The decision was made to tell the family only partial truths, to let them believe the security was about protection and privacy, and to weather whatever family drama resulted. The documentary featuring Simmons's confession aired in late 2024 and exploded across global media. The reaction was complex. Some felt vindicated that their suspicions about the burial had been correct, even if the specific details differed from their theories. Others felt disgusted that Michael's body had been essentially weaponized as evidence in potential financial disputes, that the sanctity of his final rest had been secondary to protecting business interests. Many fans who had spent 15 years promoting elaborate survival theories felt foolish, angry, or simply sad that the truth was so banal compared to the fantasies they had constructed. The Jackson family's response was unified for the first time in years. Through their attorneys, they announced a lawsuit against the estate executors for misrepresentation, emotional distress, and violation of their rights regarding family burial decisions. They demanded the immediate removal of the surveillance systems and security measures that serve business rather than memorial purposes. They wanted Michael's resting place transformed from a monitored asset into an actual grave site where family could visit freely and without feeling like they were entering a corporate facility. The lawsuit would take years to resolve, but the public filing of the complaint included sworn statements from family members describing the anguish they had endured, the suspicions that had poisoned their relationships, and the grief that had been complicated by secrets they never should have been forced to navigate. In the end, the story of Michael Jackson's burial became a modern parable about the collision between celebrity, death, and commerce in the 21st century. It revealed how even in death, perhaps especially in death, famous individuals remain assets to be managed, protected, and monetized. The king of pop, who had spent his life performing for millions, was forced to continue performing even after his final curtain call, his very body serving as proof of death to satisfy insurance actuaries and corporate attorneys. The elaborate secrecy, the midnight burial, the fortress-like protection, all of it came down to something simultaneously understandable and profoundly sad, the need to protect not Michael's memory or his dignity, but the financial empire built on his name. Whatever peace Michael Jackson found in death, it came with a price his family never agreed to pay, locked behind walls of steel and concrete, monitored by cameras that never blinked, watched eternally not by loving family but by surveillance systems serving spreadsheets and legal strategies. The music had stopped, but the business of being Michael Jackson would continue forever, his body the final contract in a lifetime of contracts, his resting place the ultimate performance venue where the show must go on even though the performer could never leave the stage.